What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
The text came through while I was halfway to my front door with a paper bag that was sweating through at the corners, the kind of cheap takeout that tastes fine when you are hungry and mean when you are lonely, and my sister's message sat there like a smirk. Family dinner tonight is for the successful ones only, followed by a glittering champagne gif and a line of hearts, as if exclusion were festive and banter were proof of love, and I stood there with my keys clicking against my ring. Thinking about the last time she borrowed my blazer and never returned it because it looked better on someone who actually closes deals, and how her mother once patted my hand and told me not to stress a pretty face with complicated dreams, and how the group chat that used to be about birthday cakes and lawn chairs gradually turned into a scoreboard with my sister Audrey keeping the stats. I carried the bag inside as if it weighed more than it did, slid the lo mein and the scallion pancakes onto a plate so I could pretend dinner required a plate, and put my phone face down on the table like a witness I didn't trust. While the apartment hummed with the grim cheerfulness of the refrigerator and the slightly crooked overhead light that I kept meaning to fix. And I told myself that being disinvited wasn't the end of the world, because I had sat through so many dinners where success was measured in the number of real estate photos my father could text to show off Audrey's open houses, and the number of times my mother said, "You know, she was always driven," as if drive had skipped me like a bad gene. And I wanted to laugh, because at that exact minute the drive that supposedly missed me was sitting on my kitchen counter in the form of a manila envelope with a signature that had changed my taxes, my insurance premiums, and my posture. The truth, which I did not owe anyone, was that I had been building this deal the way you roll a snowball uphill, quietly and against the slant, while every small failure slid back into my shoes and froze my toes, and, because the other side had insisted on discretion, I had let my life look quiet and a little shabby, let my car go another month with a squeaky belt, let my haircuts be the kind you get from a woman who calls everyone Han, and kept my mouth shut while my sister sent selfies from tasting menus and called them networking, and the only person who knew anything was my attorney, who wore sad ties and had a bulldog named Buddy. And the only evidence in my home was that envelope with the wet ink and the embossed stamp and the number that made my palms sweat even to look at it spelled out in clean script. $120 million, and yes, that is the kind of number that does not speak so much as it rearranges the furniture. I forked noodles while the family group chat lit up with photos of a long table at Trattoria Bernini, those heavy wine glasses that make even water look important, my mother in the necklace she only brings out when she wants to make a point, my father tilting a bottle like a man auditioning for an ad he did not book, and Audrey in a silver dress that reflected the light as if she were her own flashbulb, and beneath the photos the captions rolled in with that chirpy tone that covers cruelty with confetti. Only the successful ones tonight. Love you all, and I caught myself composing little replies I would not send. Something dry and accurate like, "Success is quiet in the planning and loud in the paperwork," but I deleted the drafts because silence, when you can afford it, is a luxury. The thing about being left out by your own people is that it stings in a way strangers can't manage, because they know exactly where to press, and as I chewed through a pancake that had gone rubbery on the edges, I thought about 4th grade when Audrey stole my poster board and turned my planets into a solar system necklace for her science fair outfit and still won, and I thought about college when she told our parents that my internships were cute volunteer projects, and I thought about last Thanksgiving when she raised a glass to grit and looked at me the way people look at a cracked phone screen, and somewhere under those memories, under the hot shame and the cooler anger, I felt a low, satisfying click of something lining up, like a door finally seating in its frame after months of sticking, because the ink in that envelope was dry, the funds were in escrow, the announcement embargo lifted at midnight, and I had made a decision that tasted better than anything on my plate, which was to let everyone say whatever they needed to say tonight so that what happened next would not sound like an argument, but like gravity. I washed my own dishes, not because I had to but because the rhythm of sponge against plate steadied the noise in my head, and I took a slow walk around the apartment, Seeing it not with the hunger of someone desperate to upgrade, but with the clarity of someone choosing what to keep, and I decided to keep the crooked light, at least for a while, because things that are slightly off tell the truth better than polished speeches. And I opened my laptop to the news site that had my headshot in a folder marked Business, the photograph where I look like I am about to ask a question no one wants to answer, and I checked the scheduled piece one last time for typos. Especially the part where the anchor would read the deal size out loud and the city names and my company's name, which still felt strange in my mouth, like a word you tested in a store mirror and decided you could live with. When my phone buzzed again, I let it. It was Audrey. A new photo where she posed with our parents and someone had added a sticker that said winners, and I could have been petty and texted back something sharp because pettiness is a sugar rush that burns out quick. But I set the phone face down again and reheated the last of the lo mein because pleasure, even a small one, is still pleasure, and I thought about the timeline, about midnight and morning and what attention does to people who believe they deserve it, and I promised myself that whatever revenge meant for me, it would be clean and a little funny, and not the kind that leaves you sticky with regret. I brushed my teeth, set an alarm I knew I would not need, slid the manila envelope into the drawer where I keep the good scissors, and before I turned out the light, I took one more look at the group chat full of empty toasts and remembered how Audrey had said, "For the successful ones only," and I smiled, not a sweet smile, more like a weather report that predicts a storm and a clearing, because by morning the anchor's careful voice would be saying my name to a lot of living rooms, including one corner booth at Trattoria Bernini if they turned on the television, and my phone would stop being a stone and start being a siren. And here is the part where I will be honest. If they had known what I had just signed, they would have begged me to come. But they did not know, not yet, and that is exactly how I wanted it, because the thing I planned for sunrise was not an apology or a speech or even a callback. It was something quieter and far more satisfying, and you can judge me if you want to. But you might want to wait until you see how I use the silence. I did not sleep so much as idle with my eyes closed while the city worked through its own rituals of sirens and late laughter, because when something large is about to move in your life, it hums through your bones like a bridge with trucks on it. And my mind kept circling back not to Audrey's message or the photographs with the heavy glasses, but to the meeting room with the too cold air and the long table crowded with devices that were not allowed to record, and the lawyers whose job was to speak in long, careful sentences while watching how other people breathed, and to the moment when the general counsel from the other side, a woman with the calm eyes of a long-distance runner, slid me a pen and said, "If the terms stand, this is the last signature." And I thought about how many dinners I had missed in the past year, how many times I had told friends I could not make it because silence was part of the price, and how sometimes the difference between failure and patience is only how much ridicule you can tolerate without replying. People who have never closed anything bigger than a gym membership think these things happen with confetti and champagne and men slapping backs. But the truth is the room was quiet except for the soft clicks of capped pens and the small throat clearings of people who have trained their bodies not to show relief until the wire confirms. And I remember looking at the closing statement where the number written out in that tidy legal hand made my stomach flutter, $120 million. And thinking not about yachts or any of the cliches Audrey would list with a squeal, but about payroll without fear, about engineers who would not need to polish resumes at midnight, about finally getting a proper compliance system so I would not wake up at 3 in the morning imagining subpoenas, and yes, I will admit it because I am not a saint. I also thought about a particular face at a particular table in a particular trattoria and how it might look when a certain anchor read my name into the air like a weather front moving in. Because the embargo mattered, and because I've learned the hard way that talking is the tax the insecure pay to be seen, I had said very little to anyone, which is another way of saying I had carried a weight alone. And maybe that is why the takeout tasted like penance and the phone felt heavier than an object should, but the moment I sat up in bed and the red digits agreed that midnight was close enough to bite, I decided that my revenge would not involve shouting or receipts or any of the clattering theater Audrey understands. It would be one precise cut that left no blood on my hands, so I called Trattoria Bernini and asked for the manager with the calm voice. Explained that I could not be there, but the party with my family name was mine to care for, and I gave him my card and asked him to run the tab in full with a tip that would make the servers tell a story later, and I asked if a note could be delivered with the check. Just a small folded square with neat handwriting, and on that paper I wrote, "From the unsuccessful one, who prefers her sauce cold," which made me laugh in a way that shook something loose, because humor is a better antiseptic than forgiveness when the wound is still open. The manager paused long enough for me to worry I had been too sharp. Then he said quietly that he understood exactly what I meant, that he would take care of it, and I pictured their table when the bill arrived. My father patting his pockets for a flourish he would not get to perform, my mother reaching for her glasses to read the damage, and then the note. Audrey cocking her head with that little smile she saves for women she calls fragile. And for once I did not feel like I was begging for a seat. I felt like the person who had already bought the room and decided whether to let the music play, and although there is a childish component to it, I am not going to pretend I did not savor the thought of the check carrier opening like a stage curtain just as the televisions above the bar shifted from highlights to the evening business segment. While the seconds ticked toward the embargo lifting and my name leaving the small circle of people paid to keep it quiet, I scrolled through photos from the last years and saw how many times I had chosen silence over appearances. How many times I had let Audrey perform success like a tap dance while I walked home in flats that made sense, and I realized that secrecy had given me a kind of power I had not known I could own. The power to time the reveal not for maximum applause, but for maximum understanding, which is to say the moment when people see that the story they've been telling about you has been wrong for a very long time, and in that realization there was something almost gentle, like I could set the scene without raising my voice. And I could end the evening not with a speech, but with a bill paid and a room watching screens they had turned on in the hope of seeing themselves. When the clock on my oven ticked over and the world's smallest beep announced the new day, the news site updated in a precise wave I had seen in rehearsals, the headline click clean. The anchor's thumbnail in that confident half-smile that says we are about to tell you something that changes the shape of tomorrow's conversations, and my phone lit with the first unknown number of many while the blue dots filled up from names I had not seen since high school. And somewhere across town the manager of Trattoria Bernini walked toward my family's table with a leather folder and a folded note, and I will not pretend my hands did not tremble, or that my heart did not knock on my ribs like a neighbor with news. Because when the anchor drew breath and the first syllable of my name formed, I understood that the dinner I had paid for was only the appetizer, and that the main course was arriving on every screen in the room, which is where I will leave you, with the sound of the anchor's voice rising, and the note sliding across white linen toward the woman who texted me that success had a dress code I did not meet. Morning did not so much arrive as lean on the buzzer, because sometime after the anchor pronounced my name with the kind of careful confidence people reserve for weather warnings and market swings, my phone became a small hysterical chorus, and the screen filled with voices that had been quiet for years, cousins who had discovered long-lost warmth, old classmates who had once called me intense as if focus were a social disease, reporters with bright promises, investors who wanted coffee, and in between those waves were the names that mattered to a version of me I had almost fired: Mom, Dad, Audrey, each of them stacking up like plates in a sink after a party I had not attended. And I watched it happen with the detached curiosity of someone listening to an apartment above them drag furniture at odd hours, because recognition is loud when it arrives late and the room it enters is already arranged. I made coffee with the stubborn little machine that hisses like a cat that has seen too much, sat at my table with the crooked light washing the edge of the envelope drawer, and scrolled through the first morning reactions that the news site had framed in neat blocks. A quote from the mayor about innovation, a line from our lead investor that made me sound like a chess player who never moves a pawn without a speech, a photo where my jaw looked firmer than I felt, and I let myself enjoy the simple, clean fact that the name on the headline was mine and that the numbers were not a rumor, and then I turned to the group chat and found not a single mention of last night's dinner. Only a flurry of exclamation points and damp apologies, and that peculiar family tone that tries to erase an insult by talking faster. So proud of you. We always knew. You should have told us. Let's do a celebration tonight, and there. Like a cherry on a sundae you did not order, Audrey's message with 3 questions rolled into one. When did you learn to keep secrets? Why did you pay the check? And do you want the table again, but bigger? It would have been so easy to answer with a line that felt like triumph and tasted like tin an hour later, but I had decided in the quiet at midnight that my revenge would be structured like a well-run company meeting, one point at a time, no raised voices, outcomes clear, and because I believe in systems when judgment runs hot, I opened my voicemail settings and replaced the old polite template with a new one that made me snort into my mug. If you are calling about last night's dinner, the bill has been handled. If you are calling about me, please use the press link in my signature. If you are calling because you love me, text me a photo of your breakfast. And then I added a filter to my email that routed every message from the family group to a folder named Quiet Oven, because there is a kind of mercy in letting words cool before you eat them. By the time the first morning shows started to loop the segment, my phone was a science experiment, buzzing at regular intervals. And in the social media place where I normally lurked like a patient ghost, I posted exactly one sentence that did more work than a paragraph ever could. To the people who kept me company while I was quiet, coffee on me today. And I unlocked the cafe across the street for the day with a prepaid tab that the barista named Nick printed on a sign and taped to the register. And when he asked what to write, I told him to use the words that had started this whole mess, for the successful ones only, then to cross them out with a thick marker and add, which is everyone who needs caffeine, and he laughed. A good sound that took the edge off my hands and set the tone I wanted, generous without groveling, funny without knives. The reporters I chose to call back got time windows, the rest received a link, and when an investor asked if my parents were coming to the bell-ringing ceremony someone else was already hinting at, I smiled into my coffee and said I would let him know, which is a sentence that does not commit either way and therefore draws a respectful silence from anyone who understands leverage, and in that silence I read Audrey's next text, which pretended to be logistics, but was really a retreat disguised as hospitality. We're doing a family dinner in your honor tonight. Just us, casual, your favorite place, I'll book it, and there it was. The sudden pivot performed with ankle-breaking speed that our family had perfected years ago. Exclude first, embrace later, and in between never acknowledge the math. Humor helped, but discipline did the heavy lifting, so I did not answer. I did not send a screenshot of the note the manager had delivered. I did not forward the video clip where the anchor said my name with the kind of cadence that makes neighbors look up from their soup. I simply walked to my desk, opened the folder labeled personal, and drafted a short, boring, perfect instruction to HR that changed 2 emergency contacts and removed 1 beneficiary I had kept out of habit rather than faith. And the practical weight of that email steadied me better than any quip, because revenge that changes a line item outlasts revenge that changes a mood. Around 10, Nick texted me a photo of the cafe line tracing itself out the door, and in that line I recognized a few faces I liked and none I dreaded, which is the exact ratio that makes a city feel like home, and under the photo he wrote, "Your sister came in and asked if the tab was real, and I laughed for real this time, because of course she did, and I told him to tell her yes and to add a biscotti for the road, which was exactly the level of petty I could defend to a jury of my better angels, and then, because every episode needs a sting that hums under the next scene, I finally sent one message to the family group, short enough to be unmistakable and long enough to be complete. I'll see you tonight, but not at your place. And before they could flood me with question marks, I followed it with a calendar invite that blocked off the evening and listed the location not as a restaurant, but as a street address that none of them recognized, a place where the lock had my name on it. And the deed had been notarized at 9 that morning, which is to say the room I had chosen for Act 4. They arrived in a cluster of good coats and impatient expressions, the kind of family entrance that tries to make a sidewalk feel like a red carpet, and my mother's first sentence was a question disguised as a compliment about the neighborhood, a cautious, "This is up and coming, isn't it?" while my father squinted at the number over the door as if he were reading a stock ticker, and then at the keypad as if he might crack it with a shrug, and Audrey, dear master of stage directions, lifted her chin and looked for the camera that would certify the moment, because a story without documentation does not count in her world, and when she did not find it she looked to me as if I had forgotten to order the spotlight, which was exactly the point. Because the address I had sent them was not a restaurant or a club or any of the settings that allow expensive apologies to breathe, it was a narrow brick building with a bright new lock and a small brass plaque not yet screwed into place, wrapped in the kind of tissue the hardware store uses for things that are going to matter. Inside smelled like lemon oil and fresh paint, a simple rectangular room with a long table borrowed from a church down the street, folding chairs that did not apologize for being practical, a row of paper place cards written in my own hand, and 2 tall drink dispensers filled with pink lemonade and iced tea, which made my father blink because he associates celebration with heavier pours, and next to the plates were envelopes with names on them that were not my family's, names that belonged to people who had helped me when help had been a chain of small useful actions rather than a speech, a receptionist who had let me sit in a waiting room after closing because the rain made the subway worse, the night janitor who slid a forgotten flash drive under the edge of my door with a sticky note that said looked important, the neighbor who watched my plants and once returned a package that might as well have been a lifeline, the bakery owner who kept my invoice open for 2 hard months because she liked my face, the attorney's assistant who sent me a red-inked draft on a Sunday with a smile emoji I can forgive, and in front of each place I had laid a simple card that read, "For the successful ones only." The mean little phrase that had gotten us here, with a single bright line drawn through the middle and the word helpers written below in my neatest, angriest script. Audrey's mouth made a small O and closed like a window. My mother touched the nearest card without sitting, which is something she does when she is trying to measure dignity against surprise. My father cleared his throat and then stopped himself because sound felt too expensive. And I explained in the voice I use for boardrooms that need to hear clean verbs, that this room was the first of 3, that the deed had my name on it and the mission had my grandmother's, that the space would be used 3 nights a week as a quiet study and paperwork clinic for people who spend their days cleaning up other people's messes, that the clinic would open bills and argue with bureaucracies and translate the kind of mail that keeps you awake, that the table would host workshops on leases and cashier's checks and contracts, because not everything needs a ribbon to count as a gift, and I told them that tonight the dinner was for the ones who had made the hardest year bearable without asking for credit, and that they were all coming at 7. My mother recovered first, because she is good at finding the furniture in a dark room, and she said this was noble and that I must be very proud and that we should, of course, celebrate as a family after the guests left. And my father nodded with the vigor of a man who hopes the subject might drift toward photographs and community write-ups and connections, and Audrey smiled the practiced smile of a woman building a reel in her head, then leaned in to kiss my cheek and said she had booked Behringer's for 8:30. The private room, my favorite dessert, her treat, and I laughed gently because I admire commitment even when it's wrong, and I told her there would be no Behringers tonight, there would be paper plates and good bread and gratitude, and later, after the room emptied, I might take a walk and listen to my city breathe, and I watched the information land in her eyes the way a bead of water runs down a window and decides whether to split or hold. Silence is one kind of revenge and structure is another, so I pointed to the envelopes at the far end of the table and explained that those were microgrants and grocery cards and a few prepaid legal consults. That every person seated here would leave with something more than a full stomach, and that on the wall tomorrow a small frame would hold a photograph of my grandmother stitching a hem with her mouth set in that way that means you will not be interrupted. And at the bottom of the frame a line would read, "In honor of those who make hard things easier," and my mother's eyes went wet because the image of her mother cuts through almost any posture, and my father, sensing a current he could not redirect, reached for the lemonade and poured himself a paper cup like a man conceding something he cannot name, and Audrey, perhaps for the first time since she could spell the word, did not ask for a list of deliverables. She asked who had paid the tab at Trattoria Bernini and whether the little note had been necessary, and I told her that both the check and the card were cheaper than outrage and more memorable, which is the kind of sentence that sounds heartless until you notice that no one bleeds. When the bell rang and the first guests stepped in with careful faces, Nick from the cafe with a bandage on his wrist and a grin, the janitor with the kind eyes and a suit he had bought for a cousin's baptism, the receptionist in her off-duty sweater that made her look 10 years younger, the bakery owner with flour still at the corner of a sleeve, my attorney's assistant with a new lipstick and a laugh like a birthday. The room changed temperature in the way good rooms do, and my family, to their credit, took a half step back and then a seat at the very end of the table like people who have arrived at a story in the chapter where the narrator stops needing an outside voice, and for the next hour I let gratitude do the talking and logistics do the work. Moving plates and pouring tea and telling small truths about big effort, and every so often I caught Audrey watching me with a look I could not parse, a look that asked how I had learned to do without applause when applause is the fuel. She understands. The dinner ended with hugs and laughter and a stack of signed permission slips for a pro bono clinic next Tuesday, which is the kind of trophy you cannot frame, but you can feel. And as the door shut on the last guest and the room settled into the hum of a place that will be useful, I set out 4 plates and 4 forks and cut the last of the bakery owner's cake into squares. And I told my family that since they had asked for time with me they could have it now, that I wanted to give them something before the week turned into interviews and schedules and travel, and I reached into my bag and placed a manila folder on the table, the same unromantic color as the envelope in my kitchen. And I slid out a photocopy of a county filing from last spring with a signature that looked unfortunate and familiar, and before anyone could reach for denial or charm, I asked a simple question in the same voice I had used to open the meeting. Whose handwriting is that, and why does it match mine on a document that propped up Audrey's boutique the month it almost fell? Audrey did not answer first, because she has always preferred to read the room as if it were a legal document with margins wide enough to scribble exits in. So my father reached for the paper and lifted it with the careful fingertips he uses on invoices that do not belong to him, and my mother leaned in so close I could see the small scar near her temple from the day she fell off a bicycle before I was born. And for a long half-minute no one spoke, because the photocopy was one of those ugly municipal rectangles that make your mouth dry, a county guarantee filed in spring with my name, and my supposed consent written in letters that had my slanted R and my tidy looped L and a stress flourish I have tried to iron out since grad school. And the dollar amount, rounded, modest, just enough to steady a boutique when the cash flow hiccups and the free samples stop walking in, sat there like a smirk, and Audrey finally said in a voice that used to get her late homework excused that she had intended to tell me that it was temporary, that I would have said yes if she had asked, because family should not let family sink for lack of a rope. I told her that sometimes a rope looks like help and sometimes it looks like a noose, that signatures mean more than wishes, and that even when you think you own a person's love you do not get to rent their name. And I watched the words land in her chest like stones thrown into a river with a current so strong it carries even the guilty downstream, and my father, whose instincts tilt toward math when feelings run hot, began to calculate whether the guarantee had been used, whether it remained outstanding, whether any of this would show up on a credit pull, and my mother, who measures disaster in ruined holidays rather than ruined ratios, whispered that we could fix this privately, that no one needed to know, that it was a misunderstanding like so many misunderstandings in families where one child moves faster and the other moves differently. I could have made it criminal right there, could have used the new wattage of my name to set the room on fire and watch the smoke curl into little crowns of righteousness, but the plan I had carried through the sleepless months demanded something both sharper and quieter. So I took out the second sheet, a notarized rescission already filed and stamped that morning, drafted by an associate who enjoys tidy knots, and I slid it across the table with a pen that did not shake, and I told Audrey that we were going to write a letter together, now, while the walls still remembered the voices that had thanked us for dinner, a letter that explained the rescission to her landlord and to her lender. A letter that corrected the record and did not beg for mercy because it did not need to, and I told my parents that after we wrote it they could decide whether they wanted to help her fill the gap with their own names, which would open the right door if they still believed she should walk through it. Audrey's mouth curled, not means so much as cornered, and she said she had panicked, that the boutique had carried a season too heavy with glitter and not enough with grit. That influencers had forgotten to tag and deliveries had gotten lost, and her bookkeeper had cried in the stockroom, and she said she had meant to confess at dinner last night when she thought she would be the center of it. And then she stopped because she heard the words she was saying the way a stranger would hear them, and she looked around at the folding chairs and the cheap lemonade and the paper plates and understood that humility is not a garnish, it is a tool, and that the person she had excluded had built a room where even she could sit and not be the story. We wrote the letter, not as punishment theater, but as practice in precision, and when she hesitated over the sentences that admitted without groveling, I tapped the page and reminded her that truth is cheaper than posture. And when we had finished, she signed her own name with a hand that did not tremble, and I countersigned as witness with the same calm I had used on closing day, and my father exhaled the way men exhale when the cliff edge becomes a step. And my mother reached for Audrey's sleeve and smoothed it like a habit she could not unlearn, and I let the quiet settle because quiet lets understanding find its chair. There was dessert still, the last square of bakery cake that Nick had pressed on me with a grin wide enough to cover a week, so I cut it into 4 uneven pieces on purpose, placed the smallest on my own plate, and said that since we were speaking of definitions, we might as well agree on one, that success was not velvet ropes and private rooms and the kind of chairs that leave dents in your skin. That success was the ability to choose your rooms and fill them with people who make you better. That it was the discipline to keep your mouth shut while the foundation sets, and then the grace to open the door in the direction of those who carried you when you were too tired to drag your own plans. And I did not look at Audrey when I said it, because wisdom lands better when it is not pointed like a knife. Before they left, I took out one last envelope, not paper this time, but a small cream card with a key taped to it, and the address of the clinic and a line printed in plain font. Volunteers always needed, especially on Tuesdays. And I handed it to my sister without a speech, because if she wanted an absolution, she would need to earn it with chairs set up and coffee brewed and forms sorted, and she nodded, which was not the same as apologizing, but was a start that smelled like effort instead of perfume, and my mother hugged me in that soft way that says I am sorry and I am proud and I am a little afraid of the person you have become, and my father promised to review the boutique's numbers without editorializing, which for him is love's most concentrated form. At the door, Audrey paused and found the courage or the vanity to ask whether the note at the trattoria had been necessary, and I told her that cruelty would have copied her message and posted it, but that humor with an invoice attached teaches faster. And I said that the line she had texted me would echo every time she sat to write a bill or a caption, and that I hoped it echoed into something useful, and then I added the sentence I had saved for the moment when the evening needed to leave a small bruise that would bloom into thinking that last night had always been for the successful ones only, and that tonight had made it clear who those were. I locked the door behind them and stood in the lemon-scented quiet, listening to the room settle like a new house that is deciding where to creak. And I thought about the check I had paid and the calls I had ignored and the letters we had written and the grand envelopes now tucked into pockets where they would actually change the next week. And I wondered whether the thing I had wanted all along was not applause or even fairness, but control over the volume knob, the ability to decide when the story crescendos and when it ends on a held note that may be major or minor depending on the year. And as I turned out the light, I looked at the brass plaque, still wrapped on the table, and tried to choose between my grandmother's name and my own. And I left it undecided because an unanswered question can be its own kind of mercy, a door you lock behind you without deciding whether you will ever hand out that many keys again.